We have several things, several important items on the agenda this afternoon. First off, uh, we have Stephen from the Johnson Space Center. Uh,
Yes, he's
yeah,
there.
he was slated to organize and host the AGM out in Houston this weekend, but due to low attendance and very little interest, we had to scrub that and just go visual. So uh, anyway, Stephen, are you there?
Okay, got myself.
There he is.
Here we go.
I want to turn it over to you for a few minutes, Stephen.
Okay, it's actually more than a few minutes. I timed it this morning. It was close to 30 minutes, but I'm going to try and get through it a little faster.
All right.
But I'm hoping my voice will hold out. I ran through it this morning. By the time I'd gone through it, I was about halfway lost my voice. So I've got my Nesbitt mug of hot tea here and my throat lozenges. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this. If I don't, I apologize. And I do have my remarks all written out. So I can certainly send it to you and you can use it however you like. But anyway, but thank you for the opportunity to talk to the group. I've been a member for several years and I have always been impressed by how active the group is and all the activities you have going on. Uh, it's a long time interest, of me trying to figure out, who were the Nesbits that were in my line. I've done some tracing on ancestry.com and only been able to go back to about the 1820s when my great grandfather was born in Western North Carolina, and then they all shifted over to Western Tennessee. And my group of Nesbits has been in Texas since about 1880. And my grandfather came here as an orphan in about 1880 from Waverly, Tennessee. But today I wanted to share some of my experiences in 33 years at the NASA Johnson Space Center here in Houston, running from 1978 when I first started until 2010 when I retired. If anyone who is interested in the history of U.S. human spaceflight has heard my name at all, it's usually associated with being the voice of mission control for the Space Shuttle Challenger accident in 1986. And we're coming up on the 40th anniversary of that here this next January. That tragedy and my participation in it has shaped much of my life since then, and it still affects me today. Just last month, a British documentary producer was in my house taping an interview for 40th anniversary of a television series called Days That Shook the World. And I've done hundreds of interviews on the subject over the last 40 years. And I'm sure if I'm on the planet still for the 50th anniversary, I'll still be doing them. I think I've got an Australian podcast coming up next week. Also, there's plenty of stuff out there for anyone who's interested in the topic on YouTube. There and Netflix, I think there is a documentary, a 4-part documentary on Netflix called Challenger: The Final Flight. And you'll see another room in my home where that was filmed in 4 of those episodes. So anyway, so let me just kind of get on with it. By the way, if you hear the sound of bombing and things going outside, they're reenacting Pearl Harbor. This is the Wings Over Houston air show weekend. It happens every year. And so we get to listen to explosions and Zeros being chased by F4s and all this other kind of stuff. So, it's a bit of a thrill, but I've heard it about 40 times. So, anyway, so before coming to NASA in 78, I had worked as a newspaper reporter out in at the San Angelo Standard-Times in West Texas. And after doing that for a couple of years and getting a lot of death threats from law enforcement people because they didn't like the way I was covering them, I shifted over to being a PR writer for Angelo State University. Prior to that, I was in charge of chopping onions at Taco Bell in Austin. So luckily there was a path to something better, and I started work as an administrative intern at NASA in Houston in the summer of '78. After a couple of years of making budget presentations and actually being so bored I was falling asleep in meetings, I had the chance to switch over to public affairs, and that took advantage of my background as a journalist, because what I would be doing in public affairs is working with the news media and helping them cover NASA. Excuse me. So that was going to be way more exciting than budgeting, and even more exciting than chopping onions. So in the news and information branch in public affairs, I wrote news releases, arranged interviews for reporters with astronauts and engineers and program managers, moderated press conferences, and even escorted movie production crews around the Johnson Space Center. We had a lot of movies shot here, Space Cowboys, Armageddon, part of Apollo 13 that Tom Hanks did. Anyway, but a lot of those, and I was involved in a lot of that as well. But the most exciting part of the job was being a mission commentator. NASA commentators had been around since the days of Shorty Powers in the 60s for the first American astronauts. Shorty was the one who coined the phrase A-OK that people use so much. My older office mates had been the ones describing for the public audience Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon. If you listen to the NASA broadcast of space flights from the beginning to the present, you would hear three sets of speakers on the NASA television channel. One was the astronauts on board the spacecraft. One was the astronaut in mission control that we call Capcom. It's left over from what we used to call capsule communicator. And he was the single person on the ground talking with the crew. And then the third voice you would hear would be the public affairs commentator. The commentator job meant sitting in the main flight control room along with the engineers and the systems experts who would solve the problems, like if you remember Apollo 13's near disaster in 1970, when they had an oxygen tank explode on the way to the moon. And then the people in mission control gathered together and figured out how they could overcome that and get the crew back alive. The job was something like a sports commentator, and you'd be providing detail of what was going on and color commentary to kind of fill it out a little bit and help people in the media understand what was happening. The main flight control room was like the top of a pyramid. Below the top were supporting rooms of experts in each area of responsibility, such as life support, communication systems, trajectory, whatever cargo was on board. All of these support rooms monitored the details of how things were working and reported those up the chain to their representative in the flight control room. And then any problems that were coming up were discussed. The person in charge was the flight director. All the communication with the flight director was done on what was called the flight loop communication channel, which every person working in the control center could monitor. Everything important eventually made its way up onto the flight loop. To do the commentator's job, you had to listen to the flight loop and punch a bunch of other buttons. I think there's a photo, I don't know if it's available to y'all or not, that shows me in the control center and this big array of buttons that are flashing and going off. But you could monitor a few of those at a time and still keep your sanity with trying to sort out who's talking. But that would provide you with the information that you needed for your commentary. Most of the public affairs officers in those days were self-trained. As important as the job was, you were really on your own to study the Space Shuttle reference manuals, the flight operations procedures, and to sit in on simulations over in mission control. The closest thing I got to a training syllabus was when my boss assigned me to do commentator duty. He called me into his office and said, "I'm going to put you on the planning team for shuttle flight number 2. And his 5-second set of instructions were, pick up your headset in the sound room, mission control is that way, don't F up. And that was it. So everything else was up to me. And I think that was actually probably the best guidance I ever got. I had been a commentator for over a dozen flights between the second mission in 1981 and Challenger's 1986 mission. Some of those assignments were as the launch commentator, some were as the entry commentator, and then some were on what was called the orbit shift, which covered all the main activities between launch and landing, where all of the work of the mission was done. Obviously, launch and landing were the most dangerous parts of the flight, but things could happen during the normal orbit phase as well. Launch was my favorite because the scariest part was over in 8.5 minutes when we reached the end of powered flight. So we were in flight control room number 2 for that mission. There's a flight control room number 1 directly below it in the mission operations wing of Building 30 here in Houston. Generally, the rooms were used alternately. One would be used for one mission, and the next mission would be out of the second room, so they would have time to configure each one. And just wave if I need to stop for somebody to take care of some business. But so the public affairs console for this mission was on the back row. There were 4 rows, each sort of stair step down like in a theater. My console for this flight was on the far right side. On the room down below is on the far left side. On the row below my position were the Capcom, that's the astronaut talking to the crew. And next to the Capcom was the flight director. And I would say there were about 30 people or so in the room. Again, this was the top of the pyramid. So in other smaller rooms all around the center, there were supporting people, and there were probably in the hundreds for that group. You may remember that Space Shuttle was supposed to provide frequent, less expensive access to low Earth orbit. At one point, we were planning on launching about every 2 weeks, but as it worked out, we had fewer Space Shuttle orbiters than originally hoped for. The orbiter is the part that looks like an airplane. And of course, we had the external tank and the 2 boosters strapped to the side. The shuttle proved to be more effort to turn it around between flight. We usually had some tile damage, and there was always some mechanical part that needed to be replaced. So it took longer than we originally had planned. But by 1985, the flight rate had bumped up, and there had been 9 flights that year. From 1981 to the beginning of 1986, there had been a total of 24 flights altogether, and 9 of those flights occurred in 1985. So the flight rate was getting really busy. The engineering and flight control teams at NASA Johnson Space Center had been able to increase their manpower to ramp up to the new flight rate. Public affairs, we had not been able to do that. We had to keep it at the same level. We're sort of a low priority when it comes to funding. So we had about the same number of people in the office available for duty and mission control and the newsroom as we had in 1980 when I moved over to public affairs. So for a space flight, which had to be staffed around the clock, a 3-shift operation up to 2 weeks at a time, we split the staff to cover the 3 shifts, and many of us worked on the overnight, which could sometimes be the main activity period of a mission, depending on what kind of cargo. Sometimes you had to deploy a satellite at 4 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So the crew would actually get up at about 9 p.m. or 10 p.m., have a couple hours to get ready, and then their whole day's activities would be until 10 o'clock the next morning. So anyway, a person in our office could have his work schedule moving all around the clock. Point of all this is to say that by the end of 1985, we in public affairs were getting pretty worn out. The mission just before, we designated these missions STS, which stand for Space Transportation System, and then a code like 51L was the Challenger mission. The mission just before that was designated 61C. That flight had been delayed in orbit and then stayed up longer than expected. And it was bumping up real close to the launch of the Challenger. The launch commentator, the person who was going to be in that seat for the Challenger mission, was one of my good friends and office colleagues, but because he was coming off duty and was pretty well frazzled and worn out, I told him I would take his shift for the Challenger mission. So I was the lead shuttle commentator at that time, and I was making the work assignments. So giving myself that job greatly affected my life. Just one of those things where little fork in the road, and things change forever. You'll probably remember that STS-51L, the mission was to carry the teacher in space participant, Krista McAuliffe. We had reached a point where people wanted to go beyond having ordinary astronauts in space and have regular folks So teacher was the first category that they had picked, and Krista McAuliffe was picked to be the first teacher in space. Schools had special events and lesson plans all set to go for companion activities while Krista was in space. There was tremendous media and public interest at the time. There had been some delays in the Challenger launch. One of those was due to weather, and one was I'm talking just about the days leading right up to the mission. One due to weather and one due to a stuck handle on the crew hatch for the orbiter. And they had some trouble with that. And by the time they were about to get that fixed, we were past the launch window and couldn't launch. So, but as bad luck would have it, a cold front was going to come through that night. Temperatures got down into the 20s, as I recall, maybe even a little colder. I'm not sure, can't recall. And I think had it been a warmer day, things might have been totally different. But the engineers at Morton Thiokol Company in Utah, the ones that built the solid rocket boosters, they had been very concerned for some time about the performance of these O-ring seals, very large seals, and the solid boosters were like 16 feet in diameter, and they were made in segments, a metal can basically into which was poured this propellant, solid propellant. And these were in segments, and they were sent by rail to Kennedy Space Center where they were stacked, and where between the joints, between the segments, was a large ring in a groove, and one would set down on top of the other. Over these 24 flights previously, we had seen some evidence of erosion, and there was worry, but it was more the engineers who worked on that were a lot more worried than anybody else, and those concerns were not fully elevated to the top levels of management at NASA. In their meeting the night before the Challenger launch, some of them were extremely concerned. They felt like it was going to just explode as soon as the liftoff occurred. But their concerns were quashed, and they were kept from elevating to a higher level. And that is very unfortunate. If you really want to learn more about that, you can go look at the Challenger Accident Commission report. But anyway, so on the morning of January the 28th, and I had had a cold the day before, so I sounded about like I do now, and I thought I was going to lose my voice before the full end of my shift. But I arrived in the flight control room about 2 hours before the scheduled launch, which was my practice. Plugged into my headset and settled into the console, got my coffee, and monitored the communication loops, listening for any issues that might cause a delay. There was the weather, of course, and the television from the launch site showed icicles, very large icicles hanging from the tower. Ice was a concern because during the vibrations of launch, chunks of it could break off and impact the orbiter and break off some of the delicate thermal protection system. The shuttle tiles, you may or may not know, were very lightweight, and a tile about 6 or 8 inches square might only weigh an ounce or so. It was a ceramic foam, but it was very subject to damage. This is exactly what would have happened 17 years later with the Space Shuttle Columbia, when a chunk of ice broke off and hit the leading edge of the wing, which was a reinforced carbon-carbon, but also brittle, and it punched a hole in it. We didn't know about that until entry, when the spacecraft just burned up coming back in, and we lost 7 more people. So while there were the usual concerns with system on the spacecraft, there was really nothing that would be a showstopper. I was surprised to see the launch pick up, because all that ice was hanging off of the launch tower was very impressive. Didn't really think they would, but they were cleared to launch. The pad engineers went out and said, no, none of this is going to fall on anything. So off they went. The concerns of the booster engineers at Thiokol were still not being talked about on any of the loops that I monitored. So it had not bubbled up to the level where the decision makers would have that information. I watched the television of the events at the Kennedy Space Center, including the astronauts suiting up and riding out to the launch pad. The launch countdown commentator was my counterpart at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and they did a commentary following a script. talking about all the preparations for the launch. I preferred to work without a script because at liftoff, the things were so dynamic that you really could not rely on planned comments. So all I had was a list of significant events, such as the abort boundaries. At what point did you have enough speed to be able to go over to a transatlantic landing if you had an engine out, that sort of thing. Solid rocket booster separation time, max Q, and all of those, when all those expected things would occur. My normal way of doing things was to weave my commentary around the communication between mission control and the astronauts in the shuttle. So as I was doing this, I gathered the data from small monitors. These were about 9-inch monitors right in front of me, black and white. Remember, this was the same technology basically in the control center that we'd had during Apollo. Very small sets of numbers that you could read data from. And that information that I got off of there was like the velocity, the altitude, the downrange distance from the launch pad, the performance of the main engines, and the important hardware like the auxiliary power units and the APUs, auxiliary power units and the fuel cells. And that was a very intense 8.5 minutes. But as the countdown reached 0, the shuttle lifted off without the immediate explosion that the rocket engineers had been afraid would happen. No one noticed it at the moment, but later photographic analysis showed that at the instant of solid rocket booster ignition, there was a puff of smoke from that segment on the bottom section of one of the solid rocket boosters, and but it immediately sealed up, and so that was the first failure of the O-ring seal. There would be another one in just a little bit. As I began speaking, as soon as the launch commentator had finished announcing tower clear, that's when the handover would be from Florida to Houston. So roll program confirmed was the start of my commentary, if you ever hear that. And as the seconds passed, I noted the altitude, velocity, downrange distance, and along with confirming that the engines were running how they were supposed to run and all the other parts were working the way they should. Shuttle main engines began throttling down from 104% of rated thrust to 65% to ease through the period that we call max Q, which was maximum aerodynamic pressure. That's when we're still down in the thicker part of the atmosphere and the speed is picking up, and there is a point where you reach the maximum force on the spacecraft and the stack. And then once we get through that, as the atmosphere gets a little thinner, they can bring the power back up on the main engines to 104%. The Capcom capsule communicator, Dick Cubby, called out once we got there. He said called out Challenger, go at throttle up, and the crew responded, Roger, go at throttle up. It was just at that moment that one of the solid rocket boosters broke loose from its lowest attachment point to the external tank. No one knew it as it happened. The lower joint on the booster had broken open again. There was wind shear up at altitude that caused extra pressure, and it cracked that joint again, and it began shooting out like a blowtorch of flame. And that was aimed right at the attachment strut where the bottom of the solid rocket booster attached to the tank. Still attached at the top, as it broke loose from the bottom, the booster swung out, and the top portion of it punctured the external tank, and that led to the aerodynamic breakup of the entire spacecraft. Some people say it wasn't an explosion, although it sure looks like an explosion, but that's mostly the oxygen and hydrogen mixing and burning that we saw as what looked like an explosion. The forward reaction control system itself also did actually explode, but so once you're going that speed, when the stack gets a little crooked to the line of travel, just breaks it apart, and so everything just came apart. I did not actually see this at the moment because my job is watching the little tiny monitors, listening to the audio from flight directors and all the folks on that loop, and creating my commentary. But sitting next to me on my left was a young Navy flight surgeon. She didn't actually have a job to do at that moment other than watch the launch. So she was watching the NASA television. in front of her. And so she was just a little off to my left. And at one point she said, "What was that?" And I was still in the midst of reading all of my numbers. So when I got to the end of that string of numbers, I looked over at the television, and all I could see was two solid rocket boosters going off randomly on their own, unattached to the orbiter. Well, that was long before they should have separated. And of course, it never looked like that when they normally separated. So I knew something was terribly wrong, but I had not seen it come apart, and really didn't know how to describe it. So excuse me. So I often describe that moment, the feeling at that moment, as feeling like a house dropped on me, or someone had dropped a 100-pound sack of cement in my lap unexpectedly. It was instant shock and dread. I paused my commentary listening to the voice loops, hoping to get some clarity as to what was going on. There was nothing helpful. I knew that I had to say something to the worldwide audience that was listening and had just witnessed the event. They had seen more than I had seen, actually. As I grasped for something appropriate, I just took a quick stock of what I had available. The black and white data screens in front of me had the letter S beside all of the last valid data, indicating static. There was no new data coming in. Flight Director Jay Green called to the flight dynamics officer down on the front row. His call sign was FIDO, for FDO, flight dynamics officer, who monitored the trajectory. And I believe his response was, he's on his Q cards flight, meaning that Commander Dick Scobie and the pilot Mike Smith only had their, if we had no communication with them, they only had their set of cue cards as to what procedures, their checklists of what to do in the case of this particular emergency. But we didn't really know what kind of emergency it was. No one in the control center really knew what was going on. All the information sources that we had were useless. The controller, the GC, they call ground controller, the guy in mission control who kept up with all the data flowing in, he said, he called out, "We have no downlink." And I repeated that on the commentary loop. I wanted to say, what had happened. I desperately wanted to give out some information, but I had no information. I could only infer that the shuttle had come apart, not having seen it as it happened. And the thing that just flashed into my mind at that moment was watching Dan Rather report on the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan a few years earlier. And I remember that Reagan's press secretary, Jim Brady, had been shot in the head, and Rather had reported that Brady had died. Well, as it turned out, he didn't, but someone in the back room there had fed that information to Rather online, and of course, that's what he went with. So I didn't want to be in that position. I obviously couldn't state something, especially with the families of the astronauts hearing my voice. I certainly wasn't going to say, all is lost. But I had to say something. So what I came up with was flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation, obviously a major malfunction. And then as the seconds passed, I heard information from the flight dynamics officer over the flight loop that the range safety people at the launch site reported that the vehicle had exploded. And I relayed that into my broadcast going out on NASA TV. Flight Director Jay Green instructed the flight control team to lock the doors to the control room, to stay off the phone, secure their data, and put everything away that was going to be used for the subsequent investigation. The television picture that we had coming at that time showed the ocean in the area below where the Challenger had come apart at about 40,000 feet. The debris continued to rain down for about 40 minutes. We couldn't send anybody in there because stuff was still falling from the sky for as much as 40 minutes, may have been 45 minutes. They finally gave the clear. Up at the front of the room, of course, we had the big 10-foot by 20-foot tracking map that people have seen, but we also had 4 10 by 10 displays. On one of those was a graph that would have shown the expected flight path of the shuttle during launch. And it was basically, starting at 0, 0 on the X and Y axis, going up at about a 45-degree angle. and you would have a yellow trace following the predicted path. Well, in this case, there were multiple yellow squiggles coming down from there, indicating live tracking data of pieces headed for the ocean. Over the next couple of hours, as the flight controllers picked up their data and headed back to their offices, I remained in the flight control room probably about 3 or maybe even 4 hours. I was the only point of information release we had available at the moment for NASA television. They were having trouble getting people together out of the management meeting to put on the traditional press conference at the launch site. So I stayed there so that anything had to be released, I was there to be able to do it. To my knowledge, I was the last person to leave the control room. I left by the back door to avoid any waiting reporters that I figured would be out on the front of the building. And I snuck in the back way to my office and stayed there for most of the rest of the afternoon. And my colleagues back in the press room were the ones doing the hand-to-hand combat on the, with the media on that afternoon. The next day, we held a press conference in which Jay Green and I faced the media and what had, so we could describe what it had been like in the control center that day, the day before. That press conference is on YouTube. I think it's probably under STS 51L Flight Director Press Conference or something. But anyway, if you care to watch it, it's on there. See what I looked like 40 years ago. And the best book that was ever and ever will be written, I'm sure, on the subject is Adam Higginbotham's Challenger, True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space. And this is what the book looks like if you have any interest. Anyway, I helped him get his research started with that, and I thought he did a really excellent job with it. Okay, so anyway, we can come around to questions in a minute. Let me just give, and I also promised to kind of give a quick status of the current U.S. human spaceflight program, just to kind of catch us back up. The shuttle program had its last flight in the summer of, I'm sorry, anybody needed to say something? I'm sorry. Okay, that had its last flight in the summer of 2011. I came back in, even though I was retired. Oh, pardon me. About to lose my voice, but I made it this far. I went back and worked as a volunteer on that flight because I wanted to be there for the entire program. So the current program right now is the Artemis program. That's NASA's effort to reestablish a capability to return humans to the moon and lay the foundation for further exploration of the solar system. The first flight in the program was Artemis 1. It was an unmanned crew vehicle that went out, flew about 4 weeks out well beyond the moon, and they tested all of the systems. The second mission in the program is Artemis 2, which will send 4 astronauts to fly past the moon and return back to Earth after more testing of the systems. The mission is planned to last about 10 days and should launch sometime this coming winter or the spring of next year. Subsequent missions in the Artemis program would include landing on the moon and setting up lunar surface operations. However, recent indications from the current administration indicate the possible cancellation of all the missions after Artemis 2. So after this one little teaser flight in April or somewhere between February and April, the program may be canceled. Congress, of course, ultimately determines what happens with the program. There is also a lot of private commercial space activity, launch activity going on now. Many companies have developed launch vehicles ranging from the ability to put very small satellites in low Earth orbit all the way up to the giant SpaceX Starship missions that they're practicing. Had one just the other day that did pretty well, and they're developing it as they go. And that may end up being used for the if they use that to replace what's being done for the Artemis mission. I have no idea at this point. So that's pretty much it. That's the end of my presentation. I'm ready for any questions if you have any, or if not, we'll just move on.
Well, I thought that was fascinating.
But if you thank him for everything.
Yeah.
Well,
It's,
go ahead.
no, I was about to say I was impressed to hear the Artemis. They're, trying to reinstating moon landings with the next generation of, launches.
Yeah,
And
sure.
Going to get kind of crowded up there, isn't it?
What, crowded? Yeah, well, certainly right around in low Earth orbit all the way up to geosynchronous orbit. There's a lot of pieces and parts floating out there, leftover pieces of satellites and things. And so we do have significant, danger getting through there when you're on your way somewhere else. But there are thousands of pieces, and believe it or not, all of those pieces are being tracked. But
I've seen that website. It just looks like almost like a fog around the Earth.
Like a dust cloud around the Earth.
Train.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I'm hopeful that NASA will still be in business because my son's kind of midway in his career there, and I'd like for that to continue on. But that's pretty much all I had, and like I say, I'll be happy to provide this. It fairly closely follows what I went over here today, and if you want that, you can, or just go with your recording. Yes.
Steve, Jennifer raised her hand.
Yeah, I was just about to say, Jennifer. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about how your life has changed since then? In what ways?
Well, sure. Gosh, well, that's 40 years ago, so it's quite a long time. But the main thing is that because of my association with that mission and fascination in the media about wanting to cover this, particularly every anniversary that comes up, I get a lot of interview requests. So, like I said, I've only had a couple right now, but the anniversary is at the end of January, and I am expecting to get a lot of phone calls. But I've been, in a lot of documentaries, like I said, the Netflix documentary, and some others I can't remember at the moment. But anyway, that just kind of is an ongoing thing that I'm sort of reminded of it on an almost daily basis, really. But I really do recommend that book if you're interested in it. It's quite detailed. I don't know if you have read books by the author David McCullough. He does a lot of histories, and the Wright brothers and all of that. This is book in a similar style. Adam Higginbotham also wrote Midnight in Chernobyl, about the Chernobyl accident, and he extremely detailed and really gets down to talking to all the people involved. So I was glad to help him with the book about Challenger, because no one could ever do as good a job, I think, as he has done on this one.
Statement. Okay.
Excellent. Very interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And if you need anything else from me, let me know. Otherwise, I'll probably go ahead and sign off here.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, Stephen. We're sorry we couldn't get out there. I know you had checked into getting us some behind the scenes back there, but we do appreciate the work that you've done. Your presentation and everything that you tried to set up for us.
And I want to thank you for all the Nesbitt merchandise that you sent me. I've got my hot tea here just in case I lost my voice. I'll probably pass some of this along to my grandkids, who are all proud Nesbitts as well. So
good for them.
Yeah.
Good for them.
Yeah. So they're interested in the genealogy also. So
all right, good. We need more of that in society.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we certainly do. Well,
seems like
very much.
The upcoming generations don't really care much about history anymore.
It takes a while for them to come around. They probably have to get to be about 30 years old before they start really caring about it. So, but
all right. Well, we thank you very much, Steve.
Okay, thank you.
That was delightful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.